All right, our last topic for this class is September 11th and the aftermath of those events, both culturally and politically. We're going to end our discussion of American history with this tragedy. And as we get started here, please note that you do have several identifications to make note of as we go through this lecture. So you may want to pause here and give yourself a chance to write those down for reference later on in the lecture. And as we get started, I want to begin by going over the basics of the events. This is relatively recent history, and so people are often familiar with the events, but we'll recap briefly what the events of 9/11 were. So on September 11th of 2001, 4 different planes were hijacked within the United States. 2 of those planes flew into the World Trade Center right here, this building first, and then the second building not long afterward. A third plane was hijacked and flew into the Pentagon, and a fourth plane was hijacked that was likely headed for either the Capitol building or the White House. But the passengers on that fourth plane realized what was happening and put 2 and 2 together, and they decided that they would take over the plane and crash it somewhere that was safe, where people wouldn't be, nobody aside from them would be hurt or killed by this. And so they rushed the cockpit of the plane where the hijackers were and took the plane back over and sacrificed their own lives in order to save either the White House or the Capitol building. And so, of course, those people are considered to be great heroes. These events were tragic, of course. People in New York City, where the majority of the injuries took place because of the World Trade Center, of course, are devastated. They're panicked by these events. We actually have footage that you can look at on YouTube of news reporters who are reporting on the incident of the first plane hitting the World Trade Center and trying to figure out what's happened, if there was a misdirection, if there was a malfunction, if a pilot was ill or something happened, and then you see on camera the second plane hit the second tower, and that moment of realization that people have where they realize that this is an attack on the United States. And of course it was an attack by Al-Qaeda, headed by Osama bin Laden, who we mentioned in our 1990s lecture. It was an attack on our economic system from the World Trade Center, our military through the Pentagon, and it was intended to also be an attack on our political structure through the White House or the Capitol building. And so all 3 sectors, economy, military, and political sectors, were targeted by Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And so this is going to create absolute havoc amongst the American people. After these attacks occur, we have slews of first responders, some of whom are pictured here, people who are firefighters or policemen, or even people who are not in rescue professions at all, who are going to what we call ground zero here at the bottom of the World Trade Center. And they're going through the rubble, they're trying to dig people out, they're trying to save people's lives, and then eventually, after time passes, they're trying to pull out the bodies so that they can be identified. And a lot of people risk their lives, lose their lives in the process of trying to help after this disaster. In this picture, you can see one of the missing people walls that develops in New York City. People checking, they'll post pictures of people who they're trying to locate, and anybody who knows that person can then contact them. So people don't know where their loved ones are. They don't know how to reach them or find them in the aftermath of this chaos. And so it causes the entire country to have this moment of unification, of intensity. And one of the ways that I want us to look at what that moment is like for people is through 2 country songs that develop at this time. The first one is by Toby Keith, called The Red, White, and Blue. And I've put the lyrics up here for you, but I've actually also included the clip. There's a YouTube clip within your module, one for the Toby Keith song and one for an Alan Jackson song. And what I would like you to do is go ahead and pause the lecture here. and go watch those 2 clips of those songs. And I want you to really think about the lyrics. That's why I've included the lyrics for the Toby Keith song here. And I want you to think about the mood, the tone of those songs. They're 2 very different songs, but together, collectively, they highlight 2 very real reactions to the events of 9/11. And so I want you to get a sense for that. And then when you come back to the lecture, we'll pick up with the national reaction on a political scale. Okay, so hopefully you're now unpausing the lecture, having gone and looked at those 2 songs and gotten a sense of what they're saying. And so here we're going to look at the national reaction in terms of how the George W. Bush administration begins to handle this or these events. In the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 events, we have a restored trust in the government and a sense of national togetherness. Ever since Watergate, the government has sort of been in disarray in terms of the trust of the American people. But now Americans collectively look to the government and say, fix this, help us, do something. We're looking to you, we're depending upon you. Now, the Bush administration makes a couple of early statements, and I've listed 2 of them here. One says, freedom and fear are at war. The advance of human freedom now depends upon us. Basically, they're saying, so freedom, us, we're at war with fear, terrorists, and if we want freedom to remain, that's our responsibility. We're going to have to do something to promote and protect freedom. The Bush administration will also say, they, meaning Al-Qaeda, they hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to assemble and disagree with each other. Now, this was the concept that was promoted by the government, that this attack from Al-Qaeda had come because they were essentially jealous of and despised the fact that we were free and they weren't, and they wanted to take that out on us. That's not the entire story. It's not that the Al-Qaeda terrorists were jealous of the United States' freedom, although they certainly do hate our freedom because of what they believe it promotes. Al-Qaeda terrorists, led by Osama bin Laden, believed that the West, meaning us, the United States, that we're corrupt and that we are pushing our corrupt influence on other countries like Saudi Arabia and influencing the rest of the world negatively. And yes, it's our freedom that allows us to do this, but they're looking at the long history of trouble that the United States has with the Middle East. Remember, we talked about the background of the Iran hostage crisis, how we had overthrown the Iran leader, democratically elected leader, and installed a pro-America government there. We don't have a good reputation in the Middle East, and so that's the impetus for these attacks. So Bush's response was to deliver what we call the Bush Doctrine, which stated that the United States was declaring war on terror as a whole, all of terror. What this meant was that it was an undefined enemy. Well, who's a terrorist? What do we qualify as terror? We don't know exactly who we're fighting. It could be anybody. We don't have a timetable for victory. We're going to fight this fight until all of terrorism is conquered. And we state that either you're with us or you're against us. To other countries, we say, look, you can get on board, you can be our ally, or you're our enemy. Together, these 3 things are basically a reestablishment of the Cold War mentality, but this time, instead of targeting communism, we're targeting terrorists. We're going to fight all terrorists, and we can define a terrorist any way we want to. It's going to take a really long time. How long, we don't know exactly. And anybody who's not on our side is our enemy. We're going to start this process by targeting Afghanistan, which was where Osama bin Laden and his followers were at the time of the launched attack. Afghanistan is ruled by the Taliban, a terrorist organization that is allowing a multitude of terroristic activities to happen under its watch. Everybody believes that the United States has every right to retaliate against Afghanistan and the Taliban for protecting Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And we have full support of the American people. We have full support of the UN. Everybody is on board for this. We attack October 7th of 2001. less than a month after the 9/11 events, and we have a lot of initial success, mostly through bombing of Afghanistan, but we do not find Osama bin Laden, and of course our efforts are going to expand from this point. One of the next steps that the Bush administration takes is to identify Iraq, Iran, and North Korea as a, quote, axis of evil. Again, this rhetoric is very similar to what we used during the Cold War. For instance, when Reagan calls the Soviet Union the evil empire, we're following along the same lines. We believe that we have evidence that suggests that Iraq, Iran, and North Korea either have or are developing weapons of mass destruction, and we're particularly concerned about Iraq. Saddam Hussein is still in charge in Iraq, and he has refused constantly to follow weapons laws. We have had a long-term problem with him, and we are beginning to zero in on Iraq as a potential connection here. However, what we're failing to recognize is that Iraq, Iran, and North Korea have never cooperated with each other. They're not on the same side. They're not in an organization together. In fact, Iraq and Iran don't like each other at all. And so it's incorrect to assume that these three countries are some sort of axis that are attempting to develop nuclear weapons and fight against the United States. The Bush administration also develops a new national security strategy. It says the United States will fight against all terrorists and all tyrants. Again, how that's defined is up to us at the time. It states that we will maintain the dominant military, and it adopts something that is called preemptive war. To preempt something means to act before something happens. Essentially, what preemptive war means is that if we suspect that there is a threat from a country, we should attack them before they attack us in order to prevent anything like 9/11 from happening again. Some people would say, yes, that's better to be proactive. Other people would say, no, this is going to get us into a lot of wars that we wouldn't necessarily have to fight. One of the best examples of preemptive war and the controversy that it creates is Operation Iraqi Freedom, which is what we call the war on Iraq. We decide that we do have evidence of weapons of mass destruction within Iraq under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, and so we develop a war strategy. We're going to go in and overthrow Saddam Hussein, destroy the weapons of mass destruction, and take over Iraq. We begin with massive airstrikes. So predominantly we're bombing Iraq. We're not sending very many troops in. We're doing a lot of bombing. In fact, it's called shock and awe, the shock and awe campaign. The theory is that we're just dropping so many bombs that it's shocking and people are in awe of it. We believe that the Iraqi people will welcome American soldiers and that they will rally to the American cause and help to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Of course, that is not what is going to happen in 2003 when we attack Iraq. Within about a month, the United States did occupy the Iraq capital. That was a success. We captured Saddam Hussein and tried him for many, many crimes. That theoretically is a success. But we don't have a plan put in place for what's going to happen in Iraq after we remove Saddam Hussein. And so there's nobody there to take over the leadership. And what ends up happening is that chaos breaks loose in Iraq, and all of these looters and rebels and terrorists move in and take over Iraq and start fighting back against the American troops who are there. Terrorists did not have control in Iraq prior to Operation Iraqi Freedom, but they will move in the aftermath of the operation and cause a lot of trouble for the United States for many, many years to come. By 2006, the United States has to admit that it has lost control and that terrorists are completely in charge in Iraq, although American troops will remain there attempting to regain control. We spend about $200 billion on Operation Iraqi Freedom, and people begin to question, is this another Vietnam? Domestically, we have some pretty significant consequences that come out of 9/11. For instance, we have the passage of the Patriot Act, which is designed to prevent domestic terrorism. One of the things that really upsets us about 9/11 is the fact that the pilots who became the hijackers, the hijackers who took over the planes that day on 9/11, they had trained for their pilot license in the United States, which means we had trained the hijackers who committed these terrible acts. And so we're concerned about the presence of terrorists within the United States. And so to try to prevent terrorism from within the United States, we passed the Patriot Act, which essentially gives the government the right to engage in a great deal of surveillance on American people. This is where you get the jokes, right? That there's an FBI agent living in your computer, watching what you do, that your phone calls are being monitored, that your emails are being monitored. And it's true that there are records of everything that we do online. Now, how much those records are being accessed, that depends on whether or not you're actually under investigation. So there's not actually an FBI agent, and it wouldn't even be the FBI that was doing this, but there isn't actually somebody who is hanging out watching you through the webcam or actively monitoring your emails every day. But should you ever come under investigation, there would be a long record of your electronic activity that people could go and access, and that's because of the Patriot Act. We also have very strict airport security that comes out of this. The reason that you have to show up at the airport 3 million hours before your flight now is because of the very strict policies that were put in place after 9/11. Of course, there's going to be intense discrimination against Middle Easterners after 9/11. A lot of violence, a lot of verbal discrimination against a group of people who, to a large degree, most people from the Middle East have absolutely no connection to terrorism whatsoever, and yet all will be lumped into one group of people who are forever connected to terrorism in the American mind. This is particularly evident in our treatment of Guantanamo Bay. We have a detention camp, a prison essentially, that is in Cuba, and it's called Guantanamo Bay, and anybody who we suspect of terrorism, whether they're from overseas or from within the United States itself, we, in the initial aftermath of 9/11, will put them in Guantanamo Bay, where they are held indefinitely without charge. They will have no legal access. They will not be informed of what charges are against them. There will be very little evidence required to hold somebody in Guantanamo Bay. And it is a measure that the American government says has to happen in order to try to protect people, but there ends up being a lot of abuse of civil rights within Guantanamo Bay. For instance, a lot of the questioning tactics involve physical and mental coercion, which is a really nice name for torture. Technically, these are not things that are considered to be torture according to the official standards. Like there's not waterboarding or anything like that, but they are things that psychologists will classify as physical and mental coercion, things that are damaging. Now, the next slide that I'm going to show is a little bit intense. It shows some pictures of what happened to these people in Guantanamo Bay. And so I'm going to flip to that slide. If you would like to look away, that's perfectly fine. I'm giving you warning ahead of time that you're going to see some uncomfortable things. So these are pictures of real events from Guantanamo Bay. These are examples of physical and mental coercion that prisoners who, again, there was no evidence necessarily against them. They hadn't been charged with anything. They were merely being questioned for information on potential terrorism activities that they knew about. Here, starting in this picture, we have an example of both physical and mental coercion. These are stress positions that these people are being tied up in. It may not look like it's that uncomfortable, but they're essentially having to balance the entirety of their weight on this part of their leg right here, their knee and their calf, their shin is holding the entirety of their weight, and they're having to balance in that position with their arms tied either in front of them or behind them so that they can't use them for additional balance. That's going to put intense strain on the muscles, cause a great deal of muscle pain. In addition to that, they are undergoing sensory deprivation. See that their eyes and ears are completely covered, their mouth and nose are completely covered. They cannot see, feel, touch, smell, hear, taste anything at all. They can't feel a gust of wind. They can't, they just can't see or experience anything. And psychologists say that sensory deprivation is one of the most effective ways to drive somebody mad because it disassociates them from time and space and their own humanity. And so people would be put in these stress positions where all they could feel was pain and nothing else, sometimes for days at a time. And this would break them down prior to questioning and encourage them to give answers to questions that they were asked. And you might say, well, if it got information, then it's worth it, even if these people weren't guilty of something, then they wouldn't have to go through this. Well, a lot of times we recognize now people who this was done to, they didn't have any information. They weren't connected to terrorism. They were people who had gotten caught up very much the same way as communists or potential communists got caught up in the Red Scare. And so there were a lot of innocent people who underwent these kinds of things. What you see in this picture is another stress position, a man being forced to stand in this position. Most likely he would be forced to squat down even lower, which would put a lot of strain on his legs. And of course, there's the fact that he's naked, adding humiliation to that. These dogs were violent dogs. They're trained attack dogs, and they would threaten the man or people with these dogs. Here is building on that. People tied in stress positions, forced to lie naked together out in the open while people screamed at them and threatened them with attack dogs and beat them many times. So there were a lot of really terrible things that happened in the aftermath of 9/11. And it develops a pattern. We put Japanese Americans in internment camps. We imprisoned German Americans after World War I, and we're doing the same thing here after 9/11. And it won't be until many years after 9/11 that we stop this kind of activity. And it causes a great deal of controversy. And honestly, the questioning that occurs in Guantanamo Bay doesn't really lead us to any answers. This is where we're stopping the lecture, and it may seem like we're stopping right in the middle of it, but in a lot of ways, what we just talked about are things that are still going on today. We are still engaged in a war against terror. We are still involved in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. This is the event and the aftermath that shaped the world that you live in. And what happens after that is not quite yet history. We like to give it about 15 years before we start putting it in historical context. And so 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we'll understand more about the fallout of these events, about where these events are placed within the broader span of history. And so for now, I leave you with these images and the disturbing reality that the United States has acted in extreme ways in reaction to attack. And how you feel about that and whether or not you think it was worth it is a decision that only you can make. But it's always important to be